Dear colleagues, dear friends, welcome to this first meeting of this year's Leuven seminar in classical German philosophy. Today, we will first listen to a talk by Jörg Noller on Kant's and Fichte's positions with respect to acting against the moral law. Jörg Noller recently passed the German Habilitation on the theme Personal Forms of Life, Identity, Unity, and Virtue, and he is now Privatdozent at University of Munich. He is the author of an impressive number of published and forthcoming papers, edited volumes, and books, of which I mention a paper that was published in the European Journal of Philosophy in 2019 with the title Practical Reason is Not a Will, Kant and Reinhold's Dilemma. Then an edited volume together with John Walsh on Kant's early critics on freedom of the will, a volume that will appear this year with Cambridge University Press, and also a forthcoming monograph with the title The Fate of Choice, Freedom and Responsibility in Kant and His Early Successors. And I now give the floor to Jörg, who will use slides together with his presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation to this interesting conference. I'm very honored to be part of this conference, and my talk will be on the question of how to obscure reason and how Fichte and Kant conceived of acting against the moral law. So here is the overview of my talk. First, I will give the introduction. Then I will talk about what Henry Allison has called Reinhold's Dilemma. You mentioned a paper of mine about this topic. Then I will have an excursus about Carl Christian Erhard Schmidt's Intelligible Fatalism, which is very crucial for this discussion. Then I will pass over to Kant on rationalizing against the moral law. Martin Sticker has recently written an interesting book on this topic, which I found very helpful. I will discuss this a little bit. Then I will talk about Fichte on obscuring the moral law by reflection, and there will be a conclusion at the end. So let's come to the first point. So the key question is, that key question that I'm going to discuss along with Kant and Fichte is, how can we act against the demand of the moral law so that thereby first we do not intentionally rebel against it? This would be a irrational and even diabolical act, but also we are not subject to mere natural forces. This would not be imputable. We would be just determined from outside. This would not be something that is autonomous at all. Put it differently, how can we first rationally and second imputably act against the demand of the moral law? So this is the key question. Let's talk about Reinhold's dilemma. So there is first Kant's imputability thesis, IT. You all know this from his religion. He says the human being must make or have made himself into whatever he is or should become in a moral sense, good or evil. These two characters must be an effect of his free power of choice, Willkür, for otherwise they could not be imputed to him, and consequently he could be neither morally good nor evil. Let this be his imputability thesis. And moral imputability is, according to Kant, incompatible with first external determination of the will or heteronomy, and also no determination of all, which we can call indifferentism. So here is Kant's autonomy question, namely whether pure reason or of itself alone suffices to determine the will, or whether it can be a determining ground of the will only as empirically conditioned. And let's go over to Kant's autonomy thesis. He argues that the free will is not lawless, so there is no indifferentism involved in autonomy, but the will must instead be a causality in accordance with immutable laws, but of a special kind, for otherwise a free will would be an absurdity. So here the question is, what kind of law do we conceive of in order to have the autonomy of the will? Another quotation which is crucial in this context is the free will, according to Kant, is a kind of causality of living beings insofar as they are rational, and freedom would be that property of such causality that it can be efficient independently of alien causes determining it. So it's against heteronomy, autonomy. And finally, this very famous quotation, Kant's reciprocity thesis, as Allison has put it, quote, a free will and a will under moral laws are one and the same. So this is the basis of his conception of autonomy. And from this autonomy thesis emerges what Prowse and Hudson have called Kant's autonomy problem or Kant's imputability problem. Namely, there's first Kant's imputability thesis. The free agent is morally responsible for her morally right and wrong action and has free choice between the alternatives of good and evil. And Kant's autonomy thesis, namely the absolute cause of the autonomous action, lies in the causality of pure practical reason and its moral law. From this emerges what Henry Allison has called Reinhold's dilemma and Michel Koch, Reinhold's complaint. And here's a long quotation by Karl Leonhard Reinhold from his second volume of his letters on the Kantian philosophy. This is my translation. If the will were only free with regard to moral actions and the ground of immoral actions laid outside the will in external obstacles and barriers, so also the reason of moral actions would by no means to be found in the mere self-activity of practical reason, but rather in the absence of these obstacles that are entirely independent from this reason. The whole freedom of this reason, and by it also of the person, would only consist in an accidental independence from external force and restricted to certain cases that would by no means be in the control of the person. The moral action would follow inevitably by an entirely involuntary effect of practical reason as soon as there would be no obstacle. And the moral or immoral action would have to be imputed to the sheer presence or absence of this obstacle. So this is a very intriguing, interesting critique by Reinhold. And let's put it as Reinhold's challenge. A conception of free will needs to be developed that first avoids intelligible fatalism. I will talk about this conception later. And also empirical determinism and also indifferentism. So these are the 3 points that we need to consider to develop a conception of freedom that allows full moral imputability with regard to immoral actions. Henry Sidgwick, in his famous paper on the Kantian conception of a free will from 1888, argued that Kant either expressly or by implication identifies will and reason. For this identification obviously exclude the possibility of will's choosing between reason and non-rational impulses. He goes on arguing that there seems to be a confusion between first the freedom that is only realized in right conduct when reason successfully resists the seductions of appetite or passion, and second, the freedom to choose between right and wrong, which is, of course, equally realized in either choice. Let's come to I want to discuss now Schmidt's intelligible fatalism. And before I'm discussing Schmidt, I want to point the attention to Johann August Heinrich Ulrich, who is almost entirely unknown in the philosophical debate, but in his Eleuteriology from 1788, he raised the question, quote, whether this capacity of practical reason is also applied independently of all other reasons or not, that is, independently of such reasons that are not sensible incentives, are not mere appearances, were not temporarily prior. So what are the determining grounds of reason, of pure practical reason? According to Ulrich, immoral actions are the consequences of a weakness of the intelligible character. So this is his conception. It's a sort of privation theory. And Carl Christian Erhard Schmidt, in his attempt at a moral philosophy from 1790-92, there are even more versions of his attempt, many, but I think these are the first and most important ones. Carl Christian Erhard Schmidt attempted to explain the weakness that Ulrich pointed to of the intelligible character in terms of intelligible and not empirical, but intelligible obstacles to practical reason. A quote, "When and insofar action bear the imprint of rational self-activity, or when a given substance is determined and treated according to the form of reason, then they are moral actions. Immoral, by contrast, insofar as there is no trace of an effect of self-active reason." Schmidt raised the questions first, why does not the same activity of reason, the same morality, reveal itself in all perceptible actions? So why do we not always act morally, but sometimes immorally? And another quote, another question, in what sense can reason be called the condition of unreason? So this is the very question of my entire talk. So for this reason, Schmidt is very important for this discussion. And in his attempt at a moral philosophy, Schmidt finally argued for a privation theory of immoral actions. There are now some quotations that are very crucial for this topic. First, immoral actions and attitudes by no means depend on the own absolute self-activity, but rather on the privation of it. Another quote, "The capacity to act immorally is, as Schmidt puts it, a consequence of the restriction of our freedom that is, with regard to reason, of its incapacity." Incapacity, a very interesting term, for sure, also with regard to Kant. Another quotation, "Man, once he acts immorally, is never entirely in his senses. That is, he does not have the capacity of moral freedom." Another quote, "We have no freedom, no original inner determining ground to want evil, but are in this respect merely dependent." And finally, "The capacity to act immorally is thus an unthinkable thought, a non-thought, Nicht-Gedanke." Georg von Wallwitz, a scholar on Schmidt, has highlighted the importance of Schmidt's conception of incapacity when it comes to Kant's metaphysics of morals. I think this is an interesting reference that needs to be developed at greater length, but not in this talk. Let's proceed to Kant on rationalizing against the moral law. So if free will and pure practical reason are to be identified, as Kant argues, then there seems to be no room for immoral actions that are to be imputed to our individual freedom. This raises the question whether immoral actions are to be characterized as privative and irrational, or whether our judgment of blame is rather based on the assumption that the respective action took place for certain reasons that are attributable to the free agent. So let's come to another point, which I have described as the Socratic Paradox, because Kant's moral philosophy is challenged by this paradox. We can put Reinhold's dilemma in a different way, according to the Socratic Paradox. So first, there's the Privation Thesis. In the case of immoral actions, we seem not to use our reason rightly, to be subject to an error, and therefore to act irrationally or unintentionally immorally. Donald Davidson has referred to this position as the Plato principle. A quote by Davidson, "According to Plato, Socrates argued that since no one willingly acts counter to what he knows to be best, only ignorance can explain foolish or evil acts. Such actions are ruled out by the logic of the concepts. No intentional action can be internally irrational." And here is the Rationality Thesis. We are responsible for our immoral actions as long as they are freely done, so that we must trace them back to a certain form of reflexivity and rationality. Michel Koch, in a recent paper, has put this dilemma in a different way, but in a similar way. nonetheless, first, the rationality of an action is a necessary condition of the freedom of that action. And second, the rationality of an action is a sufficient condition of the moral goodness of that action. Kant attempted to escape the Socratic paradox by developing an elaborate theory of moral self-deception, thereby satisfying both the demand of privation, pity, and the demand of rationality. And here is Kant's conception of rationalizing, to which Martin Sticker has written an interesting book. And this conception, as I interpret it, opens a way to escape this paradox, which can be interpreted as a way out of Reinhold's dilemma between intelligible fatalism and indifferentism with regard to immoral action. Kant, in his conception of rationalizing, provides an implicit, it's not an explicit, an implicit solution to the imputability problem. It is not sensibility that propels us to immorality as a kind of heteronomy, nor reason in terms of an incapacity, but reason insofar as it is dialectical. For a general discussion of Kant's conception of rationalizing, for instance, see Sticker, 2021, however, not with regard to Reinhold's dilemma and Kant's imputability problem as a special discussion. It's a very, very good overview, but it's not about this topic exactly. So otherwise, I would not have to give this talk today. But I really recommend this book, a really important book. So the concept of rationalizing thus seems to give a possible answer to the question of how we can act against the demands of the moral law for reasons that are imputable to us as free agents, and opens a way out of the Socratic paradox. Kant argues against the view that error can only be traced back to a limitation of our rational capacity. So the problem of Reinhold's dilemma is in a larger context of the imputability of error as such. So we can distinguish between theoretical errors and practical errors. Here's a quotation against the privation theory of error. Quote, "In the restrictions of the understanding lies only the responsibility for ignorance. The responsibility for error we have to assign to ourselves. We err, according to Kant, never intentionally, but always in the mode of self-incurred illusion, so that the subject, quote, confuses the illusion of truth with truth itself." But here the question arises of how we can then understand an error, be it theoretical or practical, in such a way that it is not merely, first, an oversight attributable to heteronomous circumstances of limitation, that would be a kind of fatalism or determinism, or perhaps also privation theory, and also not in such a way that we knowingly and willingly commit the error. That would be a form of irrationalism, or in terms of the moral evil, a kind of diabolical act. So how can we err for reasons that can be attributed to us, and what reasons should we have to deceive and lie to ourselves? Isn't self-deception or error a mere mistake that is due to a lack of reason, an incapacity, to talk with Schmidt? Donald Davidson has pointed out that the possibility of irrationality depends on a large degree on rationality. Irrationality is not simply, quote, a lack of reason, but, quote, a perturbation of reason, and thus cannot be understood in a merely privative way. So I think it's about how to understand a perturbation of reason. What perturbates reason? Is it something external, or is it perhaps the free and responsible person? So it's about perturbation. Davidson speaks in this context of, quote, the paradox of irrationality. Quote, "The idea of an irrational action, belief, intention, inference, or emotion is paradoxical. For the irrational is not merely the non-rational, which lies outside the ambit of the rational. Irrationality is a failure within the house of reason." I find this metaphor quite interesting because it's something that has to do with reason, but we need to really define the relationship between irrationality and the house of reason. How does irrationality live in the house of reason? This is the question that Kant and also Fichte attempt to discuss. Irrational actions can be made more comprehensible from the reason's perspective of the agent, which Davidson interestingly calls rationalizing. Rationalizing consists in the fact, according to Davidson, that the reasons for understanding an irrational action carry with them a, quote, aura of rationality, i.e., that they always claim justification. So who claims justification is giving reasons for what he or she has done. And the reasons have to do with rationality. Davidson stresses the importance of reasons for irrationality. Another quotation, irrationality appears only when rationality is evidently appropriate, where both cause and effect have contents that have the sort of logical relations that make for reason or its failure. Events conceived solely in terms of their physical or physiological properties, which is heteronomy according to Kant, cannot be judged as reasons or as in conflict or is concerned with a subject matter. So it needs to be in a relationship with reason. As Davidson puts it, mere natural causes or blind forces are in the category of the non-rational, not the irrational. So I find this distinction between the non-rational and the irrational very crucial for this discussion. Like Davidson, or perhaps better Davidson like Kant, Kant understands error as being imputable insofar the will uses reason to construct an illusory but nonetheless rational order. Rational in this way means that there are reasons involved. Sensibility alone cannot be the source of error because, according to Kant, it has no propositional structure. Here's a very famous quotation: inclination is blind and servile, whether it is kindly or not. And when morality is in question, reason must not play the part of mere guardian to inclination, but disregarding it altogether, must attend solely to its own interest as pure practical reason. So inclination is blind and servile means there's no rationality involved, no reasons involved in inclination. Hence, error must have its origin in the relationship between sensibility and reason. Here's another quote from the Yeshe logic. The ground for the origin of all error will therefore have to be sought simply and solely in the unnoticed influence of sensibility upon the understanding, or to speak more exactly, upon judgment. This influence, namely, brings it about that in judgment we take merely subjective grounds to be objective and consequently confuse the mere illusion of truth with truth is itself. I find the term confusion very important in terms of reasons for immoral actions. For it is just in this sense that the essence of illusion consists, which on this account is to be regarded as a ground for holding a false cognition to be true. What makes error possible then is illusion, in accordance with which the merely subjective is confused in judgment with the objective. Also, the notion of judgment is extremely important in this regard. Kant argues that a practical fallacy is not a purely privative phenomenon, but a specific form of free imputable activity. The empirical constitution of man cannot provide a reason for the freedom of evil because it only provides facts about his natural condition through desires and inclinations. But the root of evil cannot lie in reason itself either. Quote, a reason exonerated from the moral law, an evil reason as it were, an absolutely evil will, would on the contrary contain too much because resistance to the law would itself be thereby elevated to incentive. For without any incentive, the power of choice cannot be determined. And so the subject would be made a diabolical being. So here the question is, how can we conceive of the relationship between our will, our reason, to the moral law so that it is neither a mere privation in terms of immoral actions, nor something diabolical, something that is like a direct rebellion against reason. So this raise the question of how to understand the reasons of immoral action. Kant's concept of rationalizing that provides an answer to the question of how evil actions can be committed for imputable reasons that constitutes an order of illusion is very important in this way. In his Anthropology from a pragmatic point of view, Kant defines rationalizing as, quote, a use of reason that misses its final end, partly from inability, partly from an inappropriate viewpoint. I find inability not so well chosen, but rather this inappropriate viewpoint. This is how we take a stance towards the moral law. Kant then directly adds the following definition: to rave with reason, rasen mit Vernunft, means to proceed according to principles in the form of one's thought, but in the matter or end to use means that are directly contrary to it. Kant's distinction between form and matter can be understood in the following way. By rationalizing, a formal coherence of maxims is generated, which, however, only suggests the illusion of morality and conformity to the moral law, but in reality follows material and individual motives. From a practical point of view, rationalizing consists in putting forward reasons against the absolute demand of the moral law, and thus constructing one's own moral order within which one's action finally appears to be good. So this is the stance that one takes towards the moral law. The perturbation, the activity of perturbation, so to speak, in terms of Davidson. In the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, and Martin Sticker has discussed this at greater length, Kant speaks of a powerful counterweight to all the commons of duty which man feels in himself. Pure practical reason, by its universal and categorical commandment, sets back individual needs, and, quote, a natural dialectic arises from this opposition that Kant defines as a propensity to rationalize, Vernunft, against those strict laws of duty. This propensity itself, however, bears rational traits. That is, as in the case of the theoretical dialectic, it is a form of perverted reason. And I'm now going to discuss Fichte's conception of obscuring the moral law against the background of Kant's conception of rationalizing. So there are 4 problems concerning individual volitional self-determination that Fichte addresses after Kant and Reinhold in order to escape skepticism about freedom of the will, faced with the dilemma of indifferentism and intelligible fatalism. So here are the 4 points that he's arguing for. First, the morally responsible person must be conceived as a unified, both rational and sensible individual. Second, the free will must be distinguished from the general capacity of pure practical reason in order to avoid the danger of intelligible fatalism and to develop a conception of individual self-determination. However, a specific form of rationality and reflexivity of the will must be preserved and analyzed in order to avoid the danger of indifferentism or empirical determinism. And finally, acting morally wrong must be understood as something that is imputable in light of the moral law. So not directly against the moral law, but still in light of the moral law. So there still needs to be a relationship to the moral law, however, a confused relationship. And I'm going to discuss this confusion or perturbation of the relationship to the moral law, which is imputable to our individual freedom, in what follows. But first, the very early Fichte, in his 1793 review of Leonhard Kreuz's skeptical reflections on the freedom of the will, in this review, Fichte gave credit to Reinhold for pointing out the problem of intelligible fatalism, which becomes virulent, and if will and pure practical reason are to be strictly identified, closely identified. So this is the point. It's not the relationship of these 2 capacities, but it's the strict identity which is problematic. It's about the relationship, how to conceive of this relationship. So here's a quote. A number of advocates of the critical philosophy have remarked, and Reinhold has clearly demonstrated, that we must carefully distinguish between that manifestation of absolute self-activity whereby reason is practical and gives itself a law, and that manifestation of absolute self-activity whereby the human being in this function, his will, determines herself to obey this law or not. Fichte agrees with Reinhold in criticizing Schmidt's intelligible fatalism and notes that, quote, imputation, blame, and merit cease to exist in this theory. Drawing on Kant, Fichte, in his System of Ethics, argues that it is absolutely impossible and contradictory that anyone with a clear consciousness of his duty at the moment he acts could, in good consciousness, decide not to do his duty, that he should rebel against the law, refusing to obey it and making it his maxim not to do his duty because it is his duty. So this way of a close relationship against the moral law is impossible for Fichte, like for Kant. But that doesn't mean that there cannot be a more complex relationship to the moral law that allows us to act against it, although being rational. According to Fichte, it is conceptually impossible that a person acts against the normativity of morality through the capacity that guarantees it directly, namely practical reason. Quote, at one and the same moment, therefore, these contradictory demands would be placed upon him by one and the same power, a presupposition that annuls itself and involves the clearest and most patent contradiction. Drawing on Kant, I have already discussed this. So here's another point. Something like an evil reason is metaphysically impossible, according to Fichte. A reason that at the same time commands what is good and contains within itself the directly motivating reason for acting against its commandment would cancel itself out. So this would be a contradiction for sure. But how can evil be explained as a free action if one, like Kant, does not want to trace it back to sensibility? How can we conceive of an individual rationality which is not identical with the universal rationality of the moral law and which is the reason for the imputability of the evil committed? In order to justify the imputability of evil actions, Fichte introduces the concept of reflection. This concept serves the purpose to avoid the problem of intelligible fatalism in case of evil actions, because it allows us to understand how we can freely and imputably act against the demand of the moral law, however, not directly and immediately, which would be a conceptual contradiction, or put it differently, a diabolical act. Fichte does not agree to this direct opposition. It's a more complicated one. And Fichte's argumentation goes as follows. First, if one constantly reflects upon the demand of the law, if this demand always remains before one's eyes, then it is impossible not to act in accordance with this demand or to resist it. Second, if the law disappears from our attention, however, then it is impossible for us to act in accordance with it. Necessity thus reigns in both cases, and we seem to have become caught up in some kind of intelligible fatalism. According to Fichte, this kind of intelligible fatalism is not to be understood in terms of Schmidt's account, because it is, quote, a somewhat lower degree than the usual kind. Weak intelligible fatalism, I will call it weak, is different from strong intelligible fatalism, which is the common intelligible fatalism, because it concerns only our epistemological relationship to the normative content of the moral law, but not a strong motivational relationship to its moral incentive, whereby the moral law becomes effective without any participation of the moral subject. Fichte argues that strong intelligible fatalism can be avoided by the mere fact that it is conceptually impossible that the moral law cannot become practical without our consciousness and reflection of it, which, however, is not independent from us, but rather depends on our will. Fichte therefore speaks of a mere appearance of fatalism, which, quote, disappears as soon as one notices that it is up to our freedom whether such consciousness continues or becomes obscured. So this is the very concept of responsibility of acting immorally. So it's about the volitional use of consciousness in a way of presenting the moral law. Hence, we can only avoid intelligible fatalism if the reflection and presentation of the demand of the moral law, but not its content, depend on us. We can, according to Fichte, willfully block out the moral law by our capacity of reflection, since reflection is not something merely theoretical, but rather practical and volitional. Therefore, in acting immorally, we are not subject to weakness of will, like Fichte, like Schmidt and Ulrich in their conception of a kind of intelligible fatalism or irrationality, but rather responsible for the way in which we reflect upon the absolute demand of the moral law. So it's responsibility of reflection. Reflection is an activity that we are responsible for. Fichte argues that the reason for our obscuring the demand of the moral law is our activity of abstraction, which results in what Fichte calls indeterminate thinking and a, quote, thoughtlessness and inattentiveness to our higher nature. However, this does not mean that we have no consciousness of the demand of the moral law at all. Rather, indeterminate thinking about duty means to violate the moral law at a second level, since, quote, a determinate consciousness of duty is itself a duty, as Fichte puts it. In the case of evil actions, our determinate consciousness of the moral law is, and this is important, is not immediately but successively transformed into a state which Fichte calls, quote, an indeterminate and wavering consciousness. Fichte explains the complex process of indetermining and obscuring the moral law by referring to the human power of imagination. In order to get to a determinate representation, our power of imagination needs to be controlled by our understanding, which provides, quote, sharp outlines for it, as Fichte puts it. However, since our power of imagination has the propensity to hover and waver between opposites, these sharp outlines are at risk of becoming blurred again. Fichte considers a special case of loss of determinacy that can be related to the problem of acting against the demand of the moral law, and which he calls a, quote, result of distraction and thoughtlessness. Usually, our understanding is not strong enough to fix the determinacy of the object of our mind, the demand of the moral law included, so that their determinacy escapes, as Fichte puts it. Such an indeterminate object oscillates, as Fichte argues, and our power of judgment cannot fix it. Fichte now distinguishes three different ways of circumventing the strength of the moral law. It's not about rebelling, it's about circumventing the moral law. This is the crucial part of Fichte. First, with regard to the demand of the moral law, Fichte points out a kind of obscuring of our moral conscience, which leads us to a kind of moral self-deception. Fichte stresses the fact that this self-deception is not something that merely happens to us, like from external influences, but rather something that needs to be imputed to our volitional activity, since the determinacy and presence of the demand of the moral law depend on our individual freedom. So the presence of this demand depends on us, not the content, but the way in which it appears to us. Fichte distinguishes another kind of determinacy of the moral law that we obscure in the case of immoral action by reflection. It concerns the strictness and immediate validity of the moral law, its categorical imperative. We can obscure this imperative by an activity which Fichte calls delaying. In delaying the demand of the moral law, we are involved in a similar activity to what Kant has called rationalizing. Delaying the moral demand does not mean to simply ignore it, but rather to give reasons so that one seems to be justified by exceptions not to follow it immediately and unanimously. So that doesn't mean that we rebel against the moral law, but that we have reasons for an excuse and for exactions. Finally, Fichte distinguishes a kind of obscuring the moral law, which consists in downgrading the formal and a priori categorical imperative to something empirical and conditioned, like a mere, quote, good piece of advice. In this case, the moral agent rises above the absolute demand of the moral law, which Kant has called our propensity of self-conceit. Fichte argues that this kind of obscuring the moral law, quote, is of special danger to the human condition, quote, end of quote, since it will lead to a radicalization and perversion of the moral law. According to Fichte, the very reason for obscuring the demand of the moral law consists in an, quote, original laziness or inertia, Trägheit, with respect to reflection, which Fichte, following Kant, calls, quote, a truly positive radical evil, which is to be distinguished from a simply negative one. So here the question is, how shall we understand inertia? Is it just a privative phenomenon like Schmidt in his Intelligible Fatalism, or can we interpret inertia in a way of activity that is imputable to our individual freedom? According to Fichte, this inertia of reflection should not be thought in terms of a privative theory of will, since this would finally amount to an intelligible fatalism. Fichte therefore further characterizes it, and in systematic proximity to Leibniz, as, quote, a force of inertia, vis inertia, as, quote, a tendency of force sufficient to remain what it is. As soon as the individual will is challenged in its self-centeredness by the demand of the moral law, a counter tendency to remain in its previous state, a kind of defensive or defiant reaction arises in it, which leads to its obscuration. This reaction of obscuration is just the positive side of evil, according to Fichte, since it involves volitional reflection and also reasons, because we are giving justifications for this activity. So, and here's the conclusion. Both Kant and Fichte argue that immoral actions are neither to be traced back to mere heteronomy, be it the necessity of nature or the necessity of the moral law, nor to a kind of indifferentism. Rather, immoral action can be imputed to our individual freedom and rationality, a rationality that is neither identical to pure practical reason nor opposed to it as a kind of evil reason. The first would amount to intelligible fatalism, the latter would make us a diabolical being, as both Kant and Fichte argue. Since Kant and Fichte hold that reason and will are deeply intertwined, we are not bound to the normativity of reason in a way that makes a deviation from it impossible. Rather, we can use our capacity of reason against its moral demand, if not directly and immediately, so at least indirectly and obscuringly. Obscuring reason is therefore nothing irrational, but rather an inner tendency of that very reason that essentially belongs to us, belongs to such finite rational beings as we humans are. Thank you very much for your attention.
And I thought this Farad Alavi.
Yes, thank you for the very interesting talk. So I was thinking about the groundwork for metaphysics of morals, where we have this classification between different kinds of imperatives. And I was thinking, isn't this where we can find some rational ground upon which we can build some sorts of imperatives which might not be morally good, but still good? So don't you think that there is in Kant this possibility of actively willing the good which is not morally good through, say, hypothetical imperatives, which means willing something as a means to another end, but not as an end in itself, and thus not complying with the moral law? So the difference between the categorical imperative and the hypothetical imperative within this very distinction would be a rational ground to actively choose a good which is not morally good, and in that sense maybe evil.
Thank you very much. This is a good question. I also thought about this, but I would argue that hypothetical imperatives are not the best way to explain the way in which we freely and imputably come to immoral action, because the final ground of hypothetical imperatives would be sensibility in a way. So individual aims that belong to the way we enjoy things. And I think it's in a way deeper. So the reason for acting against the moral law is not just something empirical that I want to pursue, that I want to achieve, but it's the very structure of our individual reason, namely the tendency of becoming dialectical. So I would argue hypothetical imperatives are too close to natural necessity, are too close to empirical circumstances that mean a kind of heteronomy. But I think that we can conceive of immoral actions in a stronger way that has to do with our nature of rationality, namely dialectical rationality. But that's an interesting possibility, but I thought about this, but I would say we need to be something in between the categorical imperative and hypothetical imperatives, and this would be dialectical reason in terms of rationalizing, as I understand it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. There's another question by Martin Sticker. Hi, Martin.
Yeah, hey. Thanks for your talk, and thanks for mentioning my work. So just to say that the reason why I don't deal with the Reinhold dilemma is because I find it too difficult. And that's why I think it's great that you tackle this head on. It's just something that I feel like I probably couldn't solve this problem at all because it's so deep and difficult. Okay, so here are, if I may, 2 questions, but I can also, if it's only 1 question per person, just ask one now and then another question later. So the first that would be regarding specifically your talk was you sometimes said that rationalizing creates reasons to act against the moral law or something like that. And I was wondering, did you mean to say that? Did you mean to say that it actually creates reasons, or something like seeming reasons, apparent reasons? So that's what I settled on, right? In my view, you don't actually create reasons to violate the moral law, but rather you think you do. And I was wondering if we disagree on this, or so are these actually in any way substantive reasons to violate the moral law that you get from rationalizing, or is it the case that they seem to be reasons, but they're not reasons at all? I think you could argue for both positions, although I prefer my position, obviously, but I'm interested. So if we rationalize, maybe we rationalize really well, we have this really plausible explanation that we can provide for why it is permissible for us to do what we're doing. Do we get actual reasons, or maybe even actual excuses for what we're doing?
Thank you very much. I always interpret reasons as reasons for action. So in terms of some motivating power. And from this perspective, I would say that even seeming reasons are reasons. They are not good reasons, but they are reasons. I mean, finally, they lead me to this action. So they have this function of motivating me. And I would say, so my answer would be even seeming reasons are reasons. Reasons for my actions, reasons for immoral actions. And I would not distinguish between reasons and seeming reasons. I would argue these are immoral reasons, perhaps, reasons that are in accordance with the moral law or are against it, but still they are reasons that motivate me for immoral action. And they are reasons because they have to do with my individual freedom that belong to them. So they are inherently linked to individuality and freedom, if also not autonomy in the strict sense, because then we would need to have moral reasons. Yeah? But it's an important question. But my answer would be they are reasons. Yeah.
Okay, perhaps we go to Eleanor, and then I come back to you, Martin, for your second question. Eleanor?
Okay, first of all, thank you very much for this interesting paper. So I have two questions, both for Kant and Fichte. And these two questions are, they concern the concepts of, first of all, the limitations of our reason and the concept of responsibility. So first of all, the limitations of reason. So after listening to your presentation, I got the impression that according to Kant and Fichte, our practical reason is so limited that we are prone to illusions and an obscure and indeterminate way of thinking about morality. So my first question is, according to Kant and Fichte, do we really have the ability to get to know the moral demand that we should act according to in order to decide, in order to think later on, okay, we're going to act against it. So, my first question is, well, do we have this knowledge in the first place? Yeah. My second question is, if our immoral actions can be explained as an illusion or an obscuring of the moral law, then to what extent can we say that we are responsible for our own immoral actions? To what extent can we say that it is truly our mistakes? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for your important questions. So the first question, I would argue that reason in itself is highly, as I said, highly problematic. For this reason, Kant wrote the critique of pure reason, because pure reason always strives to transcend the limit of knowledge. And I would argue that even practical reason is highly problematic because it has to do with the natural dialectic. So I would argue that reason is always prone to illusion, be it theoretical reason or practical reason. And at least in terms of pure theoretical and pure practical reason with regard to human beings or individual finite beings. So there's a tension. One always thinks that pure reason is something that belongs to an infinite subject. But we need to discuss this special case of pure reason, pure practical or pure theoretical reason that belongs to a finite subject. And I find there is a tension in Kant that I could not solve so far, but we should always consider this because there's another conception of pure reason or pure practical reason that does not belong to a finite subject, but to perhaps a universal subject. And the universality of the moral law suggests such a universal being in a way that is not finite. So we need to conceive of finite beings in coordination, in cooperation, in combination with pure practical and theoretical reason. And because of this relationship, there's always the tendency involved to transcend the limits, be it in theoretical regard, pure reason that transcends by its ideas the limits of knowledge, but also in terms of practical regards, the transcendence of the limits of the moral law, namely in terms of rationalizing. This is the way I put it. And the second question, I would argue that, in Kant, there is the fact of reason. So the moral law becomes quite obvious in certain cases. But I would argue that Kant is quite critical about this fact of reason because he always discusses these counterweights, these sort of ways of obscuring it. He also speaks of a hindrance of pure practical reason. He discusses different kinds besides rationalizing, self-conceit, and so on. Kant is quite aware that the sheer presence of the moral law is not just given to us. So we need to work for this presence. So having the moral law clear in mind is an achievement. and is not, I would say, is not the very beginning. It's not for free, so to speak. We need to work for it hard, and we need to work against certain tendencies within us that are still imputable to us, namely rationalizing, self-conceit, self-love, and so on. And this has to do with our finiteness in combination with pure practical and theoretical reason. Yeah? But it's an important question, and this is not my final answer to it. I'm still thinking about it. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Jörg. Then we go back to Martin for his second question.
Great, thanks. So that's one thing that I'm actually just wondering about myself, and I'm wondering if you have something to say about that. One thing that strikes me is that Kant doesn't seem to entertain the possibility that someone could be thoroughly rationalizing, abusing the rational capacities, and still get it right. Just because either out of luck or sometimes, and establishing that would require a bit of argument, sometimes someone might actually be misunderstand their duties and think they owe more than they actually do, although Kant probably wouldn't agree with that, but it seems to me that this can be the case. And then if you rationalize in order to vindicate your self-love against what you perceive to be a duty, you might actually end up with a better grasp of what actually your duty is. And I was just wondering if that's possible on your conception, or whether you would agree that rationalizing, I think you have described it largely as negative and as an abuse of reason and something that explains immoral actions, but can't possibly explain how we might actually get it right. And I think that's a bit related to your point where you said that reasons for you are just motivational reasons, because you could think that if you have really, really strong motivational reasons, at least that would constitute an excuse for something, right? Maybe not a justification for what you do, but surely when we assess an agent, it must count for something that their motivational reasons were super strong, as opposed to someone who does something immoral where they have rather weak, even subjective motivational reasons. So I was wondering what your take is on that.
This is also an important question. So Kant, I think in his Religion, distinguishes between different kinds of reason, if I'm not mistaken. He speaks of subjective and objective reason as in his Religion. I think it's in a footnote. So there is this passage at the background between objective and subjective reasons. So here always the question is, are subjective reasons not free at all? Do they contribute to our freedom? And I always found, even if we distinguish between objective and subjective reasons, both reasons need to account for our freedom. So perhaps you could repeat your question. So I would refer to this passage in Kant, this distinction between subjective and objective reasons that might contribute to your question, but perhaps I didn't get it exactly. Could you repeat? And if I didn't answer it entirely, could you perhaps repeat it?
Yeah, I think I might have obfuscated my point a bit. But I think my main question was, could I rationalize about something and still get it right? You know, can I rationalize and come up with an actual justification for? So I have this course of action that I basically, I'm going to do this, right? And then I start to construct a justification for it. And I think that's a paradigm case of rationalizing, where we first settle on a course of action, and then we try to, find normatively valid stuff that basically would allow us to justify our actions to ourselves. But we might succeed in doing that. We might find actual good reasons for doing this, even though, if we hadn't, we wouldn't change our mind. So there seems to be something deficient about that, but we might still get it right in the sense that we settle on the right thing to do.
Okay, so would this be a moral context,
yeah,
getting it right, or would this be an instrumental context?
No, I actually think that rationalizing specifically pertains to moral cases. But
okay,
I know you disagree. One of the interesting things in your work is that you also extend it to theoretical questions. And,
yeah, okay. I would agree that rationalizing in the way I use it is also limited to the moral, circumstances. So the question is interesting. Can we, by rationalizing, end up being moral? Is this the question? Being moral by rationalizing?
Can we learn something by rationalizing?
Yeah, learning for sure. I'm for sure, learning for sure. But I'm not sure if it's something really moral that we end up by, getting to by rationalizing. I think rationalizing has always a tendency to emphasize one's individuality against the universality of the moral law. I think it's this conflict. And if we get into this conflict and just focus on our individuality by rationalizing, I mean, there's another point that I was made that people could discuss. Is rationalizing just about individuals, or can it also be about collectives? Yeah, this was the organizers asked me this question, but I would say rationalizing is some in moral terms is something inherently problematic, morally problematic. I wouldn't put it in that way that we can get to something really moral in a way, but in terms of instrumentality, for sure, then it's quite compatible with instrumental thought, because it has this way, as Farhad asked me, it has in a way something that is close to hypothetical imperatives, but I wouldn't argue that it's identical to it. I would distinguish it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Then there's a question by Pavel Reinhold.
So thanks very much for that talk. So I think this question is along perhaps similar lines. So yeah, so the Reinhold dilemma, I also think that it's a hugely complicated issue, so much so that I didn't really understand exactly how your account would allow Kant to respond to it. So putting aside Fichte for now. So specifically, I think I didn't get there seem to be two kind of conceptions of reason or rationality. One is the weighty Kantian one, where there's a direct path from that to freedom and morality, et cetera, And I guess the problem with that one is that it's so weighty or strong, right? So you can't disassociate it from freedom. That's the Reinhold problem. But then there's this other one of this more deflationary one, right? You mentioned Davidson, so this kind of more business of giving and asking for reasons. But that one, there's no direct line to freedom and morality with that one, right? You could be a determinist and still, engage in this business of giving and asking for reasons. So that one doesn't seem like it's caught up in this problem in a way that the first one is. So I guess more generally, how do these two relate for Kant? And to respond to the Reinhold one, don't you need to draw on that first weighty Kantian conception of practical reason or rationality in that strong sense?
Thank you very much. This concerns the conception of reason in Kant, which is a really big issue, but I agree. So as I try to argue, we need to distinguish between a conception of pure reason that is not linked to individuality and a conception of pure reason that is linked to individuality. And I think Kant doesn't make this distinction very clear, but I think we need to distinguish between these two kinds of pure reason in Kant. Laura Papish, in her book on self-deception, she in one passage referred to this conception of pure reason that still belongs to individuals, and I found this very helpful. But it was only in a footnote or so, and I think we need to have something in between pure general reason that is not linked to finite subjects as we are, and a conception of reason that is more related to hypothetical reason, instrumental reason. So what I find rationality's reason or rationalizing's rationality would this finite pure reason, what I would call finite pure reason. And finite pure reason would have some traits in terms of Davidson's conception of rationality, which I would not conceive of as identical to hypothetical reason. I think Davidson has a very broad conception of rationality. It's not just linked to morality, as you said, but it's a kind of rationality that we can still link with our individual freedom. It's reasons. It's about how to prioritize reasons, how to give reasons, how to take reasons, how to justify your actions. And this account of rationality would not be just instrumental reason, because there need not to be sensibility or something like this involved. It can be just about my relationship to the moral law. And this kind of rationality needs to be distinguished from general, not finite, pure reason. And as I said, there are some, one always tends, or one thinks that Kant has a unified conception of pure reason. And I think this is not true. Sometimes Kant speaks of common reason and not pure practical reason. And this common reason is not instrumental reason. So I think we need to distinguish between these different kinds of reason and then refer these kinds of reason to these specific moral problems like immorality, freedom to act immorally, and so on. But I would agree with you, it's not totally clear, Kant's conception of reason, and we really need to distinguish different kinds of it. Yeah.
Thank you. Karin has perhaps the last question.
Okay. Yes, thanks for this interesting paper and the discussion. So I have a small question that is maybe related to your dialogue with Martin on the notion of Vernunften. And so I'm not really sure whether the translation as rationalizing captures the main meaning of Vernunften, because I think, Jörg, that you stresses the negative connotation of Vernunften. Yeah, so if you engage in Vernunften, you can come up with excuses, or you can come up with reasons for your behavior, but it's always something, I think, negative. Yes, whereas I think that the negative aspect disappears from rationalizing, and that's maybe the reason why Martin was asking you this question. Well, can we, through the process of rationalizing, come to a certain insight into our duty? And so you were hesitating to accept this, and I was thinking that maybe this is caused by this different connotations of the German term and the English translation.
Thank you very much. So there's a discussion about how to put Vernunften in English. So some people say it's to reason. Some people say it's rationalizing. Let's take the German Vernunften. I think there is something admirable about Vernunften, something that leads to in a way to a capacity. So it's only intelligent beings are in the position to rationalize. And there are rationalizers that are really good rationalizers, and there are rationalizers that are not at all good rationalizers. So it can be in a way judged in a qualitative way. But in the end, I would say that, in my opinion, also from the German word Vernunfteln, it's something that has to do with rational endowment, rational capacities, but it's not the way it is meant to be used. So it's always in a way not in the direction, the real or the direction it should be. So there's a kind of negative normativity qualification involved with rationalizing, although it is in a way a capacity. So this is important. I would like to stress it's not an incapacity. Kant sometimes speaks about incapacities. I would always say it's a capacity to rationalize. And therefore it has a positive meaning, but in the end, by reference to the moral law and this absolute demand, it's a way of obscuring, of circumventing this absolute demand by extremely intelligent means, for sure.
Thank you. In the meanwhile, a discussion has started in the chat about alternative.
Yeah, sophistry. I found this a good. Sometimes Kant uses sophistry, and sophists are intelligent people, right? So, but in the end, they miss the moral law in a way. But it's an important discussion.